The Life, Teaching, and Legacy of Martin Luther, Chapter 2, Early Monastic Career, First Mass, and Pilgrimage to Rome. During his first year in the monastery, Martin Luther was designated as a novice. During this time, called the novitiate, the other monks determined whether the novice was sincere in his desire to become a monk. The days of a novice were filled with religious exercises designed to bring his soul into a state of peace before God. Prayers were conducted at 7 specific times each day. In between prayer times, the monk was engaged in chores or study at the monastery, or he begged for food in the neighboring town. Because Martin Luther was plagued by doubts about whether his monastic endeavors were truly freeing him from his sin, he began to engage in even more severe practices than those undertaken by the other monks. Luther would fast, sometimes 3 days in a row, without a crumb. He would also refuse any blankets while sleeping in the cold. He nearly froze to death. Luther later testified, "I was a good monk, and I kept the rule of my order so strictly that I may say that if ever a monk got to heaven by his monkery, it was I. All my brothers in the monastery who knew me will bear me out. If I had kept on any longer, I would have killed myself with vigils, prayers, readings, and other work." As Martin was enduring hardship in the monastery, the Luther family was enduring hardships of their own. Only a few months after Martin Luther had angered his father by entering the monastery, the plague swept through Mansfeld. 2 of Luther's brothers died. Hans Luther's heart was nearly broken. Then someone came to Mansfeld to report that Martin, a monk in the Erfurt monastery, was also dead. When Hans finally learned that it was another Martin and not his son who had died, the father vowed to have a more forgiving attitude. When an invitation arrived for Hans Luther to attend the first Mass his son would perform, Hans declared, "Martin shall have no cause to be ashamed of his father." With a company of 20 horsemen, Hans Luther came riding in, wearing his finest clothes, and made a large donation to the monastery. Martin Luther presided over the Mass skillfully, with the greatest attention to every detail, and without any apparent nervousness until he came to the words of consecration. Luther wholeheartedly believed that with those words, the bread and wine were changed into the actual body and blood of Christ. Luther later remarked, "At these words, I was utterly stupefied and terror-stricken. I thought to myself, with what tongue shall I address such majesty, seeing that all men ought to tremble in the presence of even an earthly prince? Who am I that I should lift up mine eyes or raise my hands to the divine majesty? The angels surround him. At his nod, the earth trembles. And shall I, a miserable little pygmy, say, 'I want this, I ask for that'? For I am dust and ashes and full of sin, and I am speaking to the living, eternal, and true God." Luther trembled greatly at these thoughts. For Martin Luther, this feeling of terror before God during the consecration had as profound an effect upon his soul as his earlier crisis of nearly being hit by lightning. After his first Mass, there was a feast. Martin Luther, still full of great concern for his soul, asked Hans, "Dear Father, why were you so contrary to my becoming a monk? And perhaps you are not satisfied even now. The life is so quiet and godly." This was too much for old Hans, who had been doing his best to put aside his disappointment. He flared up before the monks and the guests, exclaiming, "You learned scholar! Have you never read in the Bible that you should honor your father and mother? And here you have left me and your dear mother to look after ourselves in our old age." "But, Father," Martin Luther replied, "I could do you more good by prayers than if I had stayed in the world." Then he related how he believed that God had called him to be a monk through his close brush with a lightning bolt. "God grant," said Hans, "it was not an apparition of the devil." In 1510, Martin Luther and one other monk from Erfurt were chosen to transport letters to and from Rome. After a months-long journey by foot, Martin Luther finally stepped over the crest of the last hill leading to the Eternal City. At the first sight of Rome, Luther fell to his knees and cried out, "Hail, Holy Rome!" Luther spent a month in Rome. He fulfilled business for his monastery, and he participated in the regular devotions of the Augustinian cloister where he was lodged. But he also spent as much time as possible visiting the holy relics. The holy relics were the tombs of especially religious people, their bodily remains, John the Baptist's skull, for example, or other artifacts that people thought had religious significance, such as pieces of wood reportedly from the cross of Christ. Luther had been taught that saying a prayer before these relics would reduce the time in purgatory for a deceased relative. According to Roman Catholic teaching, purgatory is the place where the souls of Christians go to have their sins burned away before they can enter heaven. While Luther was in Rome, earning so much time off from purgatory for praying before the relics, he regretted that his parents were not yet dead and in purgatory so that he could lessen the years of suffering they might experience. People thought that praying before the relics in Rome could only lessen the time in purgatory for those who were already dead. Since his parents were still living, Luther dedicated his pilgrimage to his deceased grandparents. Luther was distressed at the general immorality he saw in Rome, and he was especially troubled by the lack of spirituality in the clergy, those who worked for the church. These church leaders rushed the people through their prayers in front of the relics so that they could move as many people through as possible. In this way, they received a greater amount of donations. Luther experienced an intense crisis of faith upon ascending the Scala Sancta, the sacred stairs. People thought that long ago St. Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine, had moved these stairs from Pilate's palace in Jerusalem to Rome. Martin Luther ascended these stairs upon his knees in the traditional manner. He repeated a prayer on each stair and kissed each one in the hope of delivering the souls of his grandparents from purgatory. Yet, when he reached the top, Luther's mind was filled with doubt. He rose, looked back down at the crowds of kneeling, earnest pilgrims, and said aloud to himself, "Who knows whether it is so?"